Actually. All right. Hello, hello, hello. This is Tyler James with Comics Launch, and I have a really cool conversation slash interview teed up for you today. We're going to be talking about crowdfunding versus the direct market, and I have a great guest with a lot of experience in both now. And so, without further ado, my guest today is a full-time freelancer who has been published in numerous magazines and online publications. He is a member of the comic collective Studio Alpaca and has self-published a novel as well as his comic book series Code 45, which was crowdfunded on Kickstarter and published in the direct market by Scout Comics. He's back on Kickstarter this month with a new series called Dead Air #1, which is a 90s sci-fi series that even includes a soundtrack with it. I always love including music with Kickstarter. So welcome to Comics Launch, Benjamin Hunting. How you doing, Ben?
Very good. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to dive into this topic and catch up with you and the success that you've been having on Kickstarter and elsewhere. Before we sort of dive into and breaking down the sort of topic that we wanted to riff on for today's broadcast, I am curious just to hear a little bit more about this new series that you're launching. So if you want to tell the Comics Launch listeners what Dead Air is all about and why it's something they should check out on Kickstarter this month.
Sure thing. So Dead Air kind of came from the idea of what if there was one day out of the year where you could talk to the dead, where we'd come up with a technology that allowed everything to line up and you had a 24-hour period and you could reach back into the past and kind of reach out to people that you loved. But then what happens 5 or 6 years later when that's not really all that special anymore and it's just another thing like VR or cell phones or video chat, and once I got started thinking about that idea, the idea that technology can easily lose its luster, I wanted to use that to dive into a group of friends who in the past shared a trauma when they were in college, and now they have this new technology that lets them kind of revisit what had happened to them. And when they do that, they discover that what they thought happened was actually quite different from the reality. And I'm using the idea of technology and time passed as a lens to discover what happens to friendships over the period of a decade or so. Once you've kind of moved out of that phase of your life when you're young, you're in college, and 10 years later, you're an adult, you have different responsibilities. The world's kind of crushed you down a little bit. And the premise of the book is examining these two time periods, looking at how people have changed over this period of time and how coming back to this trauma allows them to re-examine their own lives and their friendships and a past that they thought they shared.
Yeah, I mean, it's really strong hook, and you can see where it's just a multi-layered comic here. The art, fantastic.
Yeah, Joe Ng is an incredible artist. He makes me look amazing, and I never get tired of praising him for doing that. And we're working with a new colorist on this project, Maya Opachik, and she's turned in some really strong work as well. So very excited to have this out in the world. We've been working on this for, I guess, close to a year since the conception until we actually started putting a digital pen to paper. And it's a much more expansive world than our previous book was. This is the same creative team as Code 45 for the most part. Angela Hodge is coming back as a designer as well. And this is just, it's a larger world, a larger story, and actually kind of tying into the topic that we're discussing today. Part of being more comfortable telling a larger story like this is the fact that we don't have any deadlines circling overhead from an independent publisher operating in the direct market. And that was a pressure that we really felt working on our previous book, Code 45. And I want to stress that was not a pressure that was applied to us by the publisher, but it's something that's there in your head at all times while you're trying to construct a story and get it in on a specific timeline, because you have a responsibility to your partners, whether they're business partners, publishing partners, to turn in the work that you said you were going to turn in on a reasonable schedule. And I'm not going to say that affects necessarily the meat and potatoes of a story, but it can certainly change, at least for me, how I approached the details of how I told it and the formatting and the organization of the story itself.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess we can start leading in there, but I think the context of for our listeners is that this is your second crowdfunding series after serializing your book Code 45 on Kickstarter. And what I noticed and what I really liked about your approach to Code 45 on the Kickstarter platform, at least, is that you kind of followed one of the models that for serialization that I've been seeing a lot of creators have more and more success with, where you are launching the first issue on Kickstarter, which is the perfect launch platform. And then you are still coming back to Kickstarter for additional issues, but it looks like you did, we're sort of doing for the issues 2 and 3, combine those into a launch so that they get the full series up until that point. And then when you came back again, you did a double issue launch for 4 and 5. And that seems to be a thing that sort of splits the difference between, wanting to be able to keep the book coming out and supported by the Kickstarter market, but also not launching and then launching again and then launching again and then launching again for each each small chunk of the story. How did you sort of come about that approach with that Kickstarter, and what was your thinking there?
So it's interesting that you mentioned this particular strategy. This is something we're going to avoid doing with Dead Air. And it's not necessarily because the strategy is bad, but because I think it has pros and cons, and it really depends on the situation that you find yourself in as a creator and the timeline that you're working on. The primary reason we went with doing the first issue on its own and then doing what we call the mega issue, which was like 2 and 3 combined, about 52, 58 pages, and then replicating that for the second campaign, was because we wanted to get the book finished so that we could present it to Scout. Scout was extremely patient with us about the book. I believe we were 18 months to 2 years from signing the contract before we ended up in stores. And part of that also was the pandemic was going on. There were a lot of paper shortages. A lot of publishing times got pushed forward. Diamond Distribution did what Diamond Distribution did. And so there were a lot of knock-on effects that altered the scheduling for Code 45. But what was nice about this is what you mentioned. Kickstarter campaigns are not easy to do, in the sense that there's a lot of preparation before you run the campaign, a lot of stress while you're doing the campaign, and then you have to fulfill afterwards. So you kind of have to ask yourself, how many times do I want to do this in a year? And how many times can I do this in a year before it starts to affect my ability to create new books? Because that time that you spend fulfilling and promoting is time that you're not necessarily spending writing and drawing. So we were able to, by putting 2 books together, we were able to get the funding that we needed in order to make this book a reality and do it in a shortened period of time. But there's a lot of, there are additional stresses that came with that, in the sense that it seems easier. Well, I'm only going to run 2 Kickstarters this year instead of 3. But you still have to come up with the art and the story for those books. And to ask an artist, Joe is an incredible creative partner. It's like he reaches into my brain and pulls images out fully formed and puts them on the page. It's an incredible relationship. But asking him to do that for 52 pages in a row on a tight timeline to meet a Kickstarter deadline is difficult. That's something that I think is a challenge for almost any artist.
Yeah, and when you were launching those double-sized or double issue Kickstarter launches, how much of the work were you trying to get done in advance? Were you doing were you saying we're not launching until all 52 pages are done and complete, and so that it really is just ready to go to print? Or were you, giving yourself a little bit of leeway and expecting that the art would continue to come in for a little bit after the campaign was going on and then wrapped? What was your approach there?
So for the first issue, the single issue, everything was completed before we launched, because I'm going to be honest, I didn't know anything about Kickstarter when I created my first book. We created the book, we went to independent publishers, we had a publishing contract, and then we went to Kickstarter, which I think is kind of maybe a little bit backwards from how people are normally approaching it. For the second book, we had the majority of issue 2 complete before we went to Kickstarter, and we completed issue 3 during the Kickstarter and afterwards. For the third and final campaign, we did a mix where we had much of the groundwork done for the book. but most of the art took place after the Kickstarter. And again, this was during the pandemic, so there were a lot of stresses on people unrelated necessarily
Yeah.
to comic books. It was not a great time to be creating anything. I'm sure it would have been a lot easier. I mean, obviously, everything in life would have been a lot easier if we hadn't been subjected to that. We were amazed at how many people were willing to come out and support independent comics during that time. It's incredible still to think about it, that during one of the worst times in human history, people were still like, I want to help you bring your vision to life. I'm incredibly grateful for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we saw like 100 projects kind of disappeared from the Kickstarter platform that would normally be launching in the few months after the pandemic. It was a massive drop, but for the creators that went forward, many of them had like record-breaking launches, their best launches ever. And I think there was some sort of psychology where like the whole world is uncertain, but one thing that creators could do and that backers could do is go about, launching and trying to support the stuff that you love the way you would in any condition. And I think that there was a rally around effect of that. And so, yeah, I mean, I think we lucked out. Also that Kickstarter just exists when, as you said, so many traditional publishers were shutting down. Diamond closed its doors for a couple of weeks. Even the biggest publishers had disruptions to what was going on. So yeah, it was good times. And now it's sort of like we're past that, but I know there's their own challenges right now for creators that are out there on Kickstarter and trying to keep this whole thing rolling. So
for sure. And thinking more on your question about when we chose to launch before the book was completed, especially for the final one, we had to because we had a publishing contract and a loose schedule with Scout to have the book out in stores. We had to be cognizant of the fact that we didn't want our supporters to receive their books after our book was already out on the shelves, even if it was just issue 1 and they were getting issues 4 and 5 or the whole series completed together. And in that final campaign, we actually did 4 and 5 and a collected trade at the same time. So it was a lot going on, and trying to juggle all of that stuff meant that we had to commit to a launch date and a delivery date regardless of when the work was complete. And that creates stresses of its own, because then you're up against a deadline that isn't necessarily in your hands and maybe isn't the one you would have chosen, but it's just circumstances lead you to these arbitrary times on a calendar, and that's something that I'm really enjoying now with Dead Air, where we're not currently pursuing the idea of direct market with this book. Having the freedom to do it entirely on our own terms has really taken a lot of stress off. And it's allowed, I think, the creativity on both sides, at least for me as a writer, and I know Joe's feeling it too, just to kind of soar a little bit more than we did with Code 45 towards the end, where we're very proud of the book and we're really happy with how it came out. But this book it feels different because of those changes in scheduling.
Yeah. Yeah. And, the direct market really has always been a market that is more for kind of assembly line comics. Very rare nowadays anyway is the Marvel and DC book where you get a consistent run monthly from the same team for more than even a few issues before they're doing fill-in artists or switching teams or rebooting or relaunching. It's just like there's a lot of work that goes into a comic book, and to expect those to come out every single month, which is what the direct market really seems to thrive upon, lest you become quickly irrelevant, is definitely a challenge. And the nice thing I think about the Kickstarter model is there doesn't seem to be a backer. Backers seem to have a longer memory on Kickstarter than they do at the comic book shop. So.
I think you're right about the memory for sure. I mean, our last Kickstarter campaign finished, I would say 18 months ago, and we launched yesterday with Dead Air, and we already have a ton of people returning. Yeah. And the books are different. I mean, obviously same writer, same artist, but the themes are a little different. The story's a little different. And we still have people who remembered us and who wanted to be a part of it and who specifically are back because of Code 45. And I don't know if in the direct market you can necessarily have an 18-month gap between projects and have the same. I mean, I'm not an expert on that that marketing, but it feels like the institutional memory of Kickstarter is fairly strong. And I think also it helps, and I mean this should be obvious, but if you do what you say you're going to do on Kickstarter, if you create a project and you deliver that project, people remember that, because not everyone necessarily does that. And I think some people are nervous about crowdfunding if they're first timers. And if they have a good experience with you and your creative team, they're going to come back for more because they know that you're going to deliver a second time, a third time, etc.
Yeah, I think you are absolutely right on that. And it's rather like with the direct market, it's a very much an intermediary sales channel, right? So like you list a book and then you get an order from a single entity that is Diamond, that is just a number of orders that they take from their customers. And so on Kickstarter, you basically have one-to-one support from individuals. Sometimes it's 50 to 100 individuals. For some bigger campaigns, it's in the hundreds or even thousands of individuals that are supporting you, but you have that direct ability to have two-way conversations with those backers. And there isn't that sort of intermediary that there is in the direct market, such that when you go away from the direct market, you just kind of like come back and you're listed, but there isn't this ongoing conversation with your customer base that you can have in the lead up to and during your launches that you can have on Kickstarter. So that's definitely, I think, a part of why that retention is possible even.
One of the starkest differences we found moving between the two markets was exactly as you just mentioned. In Kickstarter, you have hundreds or thousands of personal relationships. You're selling directly to people who are interested in your story and want to have a relationship with the story and with you as a creator. But when you're in the direct market, it's a business to business relationship, because you're no longer, it seems like you would still be selling your book and advertising your book to individual readers, but the reality is you're not. You're actually selling your book to comic book stores. You have to convince people who make purchase decisions or ordering decisions at comic book stores that your book is something that they'll, one, be able to sell, and two, will be able to sell quickly enough to justify having books on the shelf that are taking place of other books they know they can sell, especially if you're a beginner. So as a first timer, that's a challenge. We went from having an active social media presence and great interaction with individual readers and supporters to sending postcards to stores across the United States and Canada that I had never interacted with before. And you're kind of coming in cold, even if you have, like, Scout was able to supply us with relationships that they had already established as a publisher. So these are stores that are friendly to books that come from Scout. But because Scout has such a broad mandate, they don't necessarily specialize in any one genre. A Scout book doesn't necessarily mean a specific type of book, because there are so many different types of Scout books. So even then, when I'm writing to someone who in the past has ordered books from Scout from the distributor, they don't know necessarily what my book is going to be like in terms of past Scout books they've already sold. So you're building all these new relationships again, and you're not building them one-on-one, you're building them business to business. And it's a totally different approach. And most of the strategies that we had used that were very successful on Kickstarter, because we had really great projects and everything went very smoothly, and just in terms of interacting with our supporters, almost none of that was useful to us. And so you hit this, like, it's like a wall, almost, the learning curve, where you're going straight up again, trying to figure everything out. And that was a huge challenge.
Yeah. So talk to me a little bit more about your experience releasing Code 45 through the Scout Comics launch. Like, did you have big expectations going in? Did you, what were you hoping for? What surprised you? I'm curious what that was like going through that the first time.
I think expectations, since I'm so new to comic books, I mean, I came into comics late in life. I'm in my early 40s now, and I didn't really start seriously reading comics until I was in my early 30s. So I've been reading for about 10 years, and I didn't know a lot about the history of the industry and the business machinations all behind that. One of I think the most interesting contrasts between going direct market versus going on to crowdfunding is in crowdfunding, you start small and then you keep building your audience. So with Code 45, we saw increases in supporters and both financially and the numbers of supporters with each passing campaign that we did. And that's another thing that we're looking at with Dead Air. The idea, instead of having mega issues where we combine issues together, we're going to have regular releases of single issues because that helps you build your audience over time. In the direct market, it's the exact opposite. Almost always, unless you're a very well-established creator with a huge fan base, wherein a lot of these rules don't apply, when you release your issue number one, that is the copy of the book that is going to sell the best. And that's what we saw for Code 45. I would say that our first issue probably sold 4 to 5 times better than our final issue. So it's the exact opposite of what you do with crowdfunding. You don't build an audience issue by issue in the direct market. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There's so many people are collectors who buy issue number one because they want to own issue number one. It's important from a collecting perspective. And it's also the fact that comic book stores know this. They know that issue number one sells stronger than any other issue. So you're going to get a strong number of initial orders, probably in the thousands or tens of thousands, depending on your stature as a creator. But the second issue, the reorders, are going to be much smaller. So because you're kind of at the mercy of the intermediaries, the distributors, and the comic book stores in terms of the number of books that are being ordered, you don't really have the same kind of control that you would in terms of marketing to get, you don't really know how many books are out there in stores until those orders come in. So you see that drop off, and it's just such a huge difference from crowdfunding, where you can continually build like a ladder of support, almost like a pyramid. Like people tell their friends and they tell their friends, and then all of a sudden your campaigns are getting bigger and bigger if you keep delivering with the same level of quality and in a timely manner.
Yeah. I mean, we've definitely saw that the drop-offs can be really disheartening, especially if even if your order number ones are really good and you're excited about those. Like just by human nature, coming back for issue two and seeing like a 40, 50, 60% drop, it can just it can be really gutting to the team. And you said there's the psychology of the number one and how, most creators or most collectors out there, people are willing to take a chance on a first issue, but it might not be for them going forward. I also know that just with the changing landscape of comics, the breadth and the total amount of series that come out and that are out there to order, a lot of comic shops have sort of moved away from investing heavily in backlists.
Yeah.
So the chances that someone is going to come in and buy a Code 45 number 4 if they missed 1, 2, and 3, and that less stores are actually investing in a backlist for series, especially indie series, just makes it really tough to justify having that book on the shelf for comic book creators. But that's where Kickstarter is so good, is that because we are controlling our supply, savvy creators are launching first issues, are including the first issue and selling more of the first issue with every subsequent serial launch. And in cases where you're selling out of the first issue, rolling a reprint or a special edition or a new cover into your serialized Kickstarter launches just makes a ton of sense. So that, and I mean, I've found if you just look at traffic, the vast majority of people that hit a campaign during a launch are actually brand new people.
I completely
never
agree.
backed it before.
That was the biggest surprise when we moved from issue number 1 to issues 2 and 3 in Code 45 was that, I thought that we would see a lot of returning people, but 50% of the people who came in, I made it a much bigger campaign, were brand new to the book. And the great thing about Kickstarter is you have unlimited shelf space. You could always have your issue number one available. People can jump into your series at any time. And I know if you're running like 17 or 18 books into a series, it can start to get unwieldy. Maybe you're renting a storage locker at that point just to keep everything under control. But it's still an advantage that you have that you don't have in the direct market. And I fully empathize with comic book store operators. They have limited physical space and they have to stock the shelves with books they can sell. That's just the reality of it. And Scout was extremely upfront about this entire process. I mean, we were completely new to it. So they told us, look, you're going to see a drop off in orders. This is just how it is. We feel like this book is going to do very strong when it comes out as a trade. So we're not concerned about that. And they did sell, even with the drop off, Scout sold an impressive number of copies of Code 45. We're really happy with how that turned out. I have nothing but good things to say about our relationship with them as a publisher. And we do have a collected version of the book that's coming out in December. And that was another really interesting thing that we necessarily weren't prepared for, but the timelines for publishing, they can really be extended. Scout is published, they're partnering with Simon & Schuster, a traditional bookseller, for the trade of Code 45. And a big part of that was because it allows them to more easily access traditional bookstores. But because of that, we started working with Simon & Schuster last December. So it's going to be a full 12 months before that book, which has been in the works with them, going through their sales channels, going through their, their print scheduling. It's going to be a full 12 months before that actually hits stores. And it's actually almost a little bit more than a year since the final single copy issue of Code 45 came out. So you're dealing with, like, if you're in a Kickstarter campaign and you're like, if I was only going to release one book a year, that kind of feels like a huge gap that I'd have to overcome. And in the direct market, you don't really have a choice necessarily, because there are a lot of books coming out. You have to fit into a schedule that includes everyone that your publisher is publishing and also that their partners are publishing. So you have to work with what you're presented, and you don't have the same level of control that you do over a Kickstarter campaign.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you say that. And one of my knocks on comics as just a medium and frustrations with it is how traditionally it's sort of been all your sales come in when the new thing launches, and then the book might as well, and then the book just kind of goes away.
Yeah, and where is it? Like
and we as creators move on, and we're on to the next thing, and it's just sort of like, and then it's gone, and all of that work goes into it. And I compare that to some other products, like we have the whole children's board book thing with Seas for Cthulhu, and that book sells hundreds of copies every single month to brand new people that are discovering it because it's out there in places where they're buying and shopping and looking for work. But I love the idea that comics can move more towards the model that we see with some other content, like Netflix. If you go look at like the top 10 movies on Netflix right now, or the top 10 TV shows, some of them are brand new, like Netflix originals. Some of them are movies that released 4 or 5 years ago with like a marquee hook or a actor that's suddenly hot, but the movie itself wasn't that big a thing back then. And it's just but the discoverability, the ability to breathe new life into stuff, to get it into different channels, to partner with other publishers that have a unique take on it. The English reading and comics graphic novel reading market, most of them have not stumbled upon any of our Kickstarter stuff. And so the idea that you put so much work into this thing, it should have a longer shelf life. It should get renewed opportunities over a lifespan beyond just the initial Kickstarter launch or the month it's out in Diamond. So I love that Scout's helping you guys do that. Talk to me a little bit about the approach that you're planning on taking with Dead Air. Is it another sort of self-contained miniseries? Is it and what kind of launch schedule, given what and now you've got one series under your belt, and also that you don't have to also factor in a publisher's distribution? What are you going to be shooting for in terms of how often your Kickstarters, how you're setting your goals, etc.?
We do intend to keep this as a limited series like we did before. We're going to be stretching our legs a little bit more. I would say Code 45 was a 5-issue series because I figured, since it's the first time I'm doing this, I don't want to get in over my head. I want to tell a story that's contained enough where I know I can end it, and I know I'm not just rambling on and maybe losing the plot a bit. with this book, it's probably going to be 6 to 7 issues. One of the things that we've discovered while creating it, and again, this is a nice part of not being locked into a publishing schedule, is there are some parts that are a little bit longer. We're going to be able to expand more on certain characters and certain narrative threads than we had thought at the beginning. Working through the editing process, we have a great editor, Sebastian Gerner, who's helping us out with this, has kind of been illustrative that we can do more with this project than we had initially intended. In terms of how many times we're going to publish, if you're looking at a given year, I would say 3 books a year is what we're aiming at. Obviously, we started a little later this year, and when you start to factor in things like Christmas holidays, Thanksgiving holidays, that kind of stuff, where maybe you don't want to be up against stuff that's drawing people's attention away from Kickstarter, we'll probably have the second book out in the fall. That's our goal. And then hit 3 books a year starting next year. I mean, this is all assuming that I don't hit some kind of crazy writer's block. Joe doesn't have some kind of artist block, things. But if that kind of stuff does happen, the fact that we're in control of our destiny from a scheduling perspective allows it to be less stressful when it does. And that's kind of, I think, the upper limit of the number of Kickstarter projects I would want to run in a year. 3 is a lot to do when you're promoting and when you're fulfilling. The other nice thing about having the same book come out again and again, though, is that there's a crescendo, there's a wave that you can ride, and you're often selling to people who are already interested in the book. They're waiting for that next issue to come out. You don't necessarily have to tell them because they're checking their emails, they're watching their Kickstarter updates, all that stuff, because they want to be a part of what you're doing. So that's a nice bit of momentum that we'll be able to count on, and it'll take some of the workload off of us in terms of getting people to know that there's another issue of Dead Air out there. And we use a strategy for all of our books where we register a URL that's related to the book. This is deadaircomic.com. And whenever you go there, it will by default take you to the latest Kickstarter campaign. So you don't have to necessarily check Kickstarter. You can just check the URL or check the mailing list that comes with it. We did that with Code 45 as well, and it worked very well.
Nice. Tell me just a little bit about Studio Alpaca and being a part of a collective. How did that come about? And what's a collective for the uninitiative? And why is it something that some creators might think about starting or joining?
Well, so when we finished Code 45, I wasn't sure what was next. And Joe works for a lot of other properties. He's an artist who's in demand. And I wasn't sure if he was interested in doing a second book together right away, because it's honestly, as we've talked about, so much work to be in one world for so long. But the reality is, Joe and Angela are the people I trust the most in the world of comics, just in terms of being able to vet my ideas, being able to tell me whether something's good, whether something's bad, or maybe change the direction of something, or how something could be presented visually. So when I started coming up with the ideas for Dead Air, I was talking it through with them, and we came to the realization that even if we weren't necessarily always working on the same projects together, we had a number of complementary skill sets. Angela's a fantastic designer. Joe is a great artist. Angela works in product design and visual design and has for decades. So we have these complementary skill sets that we could offer to each other on our various projects, even if we weren't necessarily writing or drawing specific or designing specifically for each other. And the more we talked about this, the more we realized that we could bring ourselves together under a single banner. And we came up with Studio Alpaca. I've always liked alpacas. They're pretty cute. And I think everyone likes that animal. There's not really any alpaca haters out there. And also, kind of a funny aside, I live in Montreal, Quebec, and in order to register a business in Quebec, it has to have a French name. And we wanted to have, because most people here speak French as a first language, we wanted to have a name that worked in both languages. So Studio Alpaca, fortunately, both of those words mean the same thing in French and in English. We decided to create this collective where we could help each other with our projects and kind of push each other through any issues that we were having, or pinch hit for each other when we needed to. And the other nice thing that comes with putting a collective together is it gives a through line for people who like you as a creator and enjoy your projects. If someone likes my writing and someone likes Joe's art, and they come to Studio Alpaca and understand that underneath that banner, you're going to get one of those things. It allows people to kind of have a focal point for the projects that you're creating. One of the things we thought when we were done with Dead Air was, when we were done with Code 45, we had all these people who supported us, and they're still out there. And as you said, like the book, it feels ephemeral in a way, like it goes away in your mind and in the minds of marketing, but in the minds of the people who read it, it's still very much alive. And we wanted to find a way to keep those people involved in what we were doing. And we couldn't just say, oh, dead air from the people who made Code 45. It's a lot easier to say dead air, part of the Studio Alpaca collective, and then have people understand that all the books that are related to Studio Alpaca have those same elements together. So it's kind of, I guess you could call it branding, but really it's more, I like the collective term more because it's not necessarily a business operation. We're not an independent publisher. We're not going to be putting out work from people who approach us out of the blue, even if they have a great idea. It's not our mandate. But if Joe has a book that I'm not involved in, it's still going to be a Studio Alpaca book, and I'm going to do everything I can to try and make people aware that, hey, Joe's got another great project out there, and you're probably going to like it just like you liked Dead Air or Code 45.
Yeah, that's awesome. I also noticed, and this is something that I hadn't really paid attention to or even talked too much on the Comics Launch podcast, but I noticed for Code 45 back in the first launch, you actually had it took advantage of this little kind of, I think, a little known thing that you can actually set up your Kickstarter rewards for local pickup.
Yeah.
And I think you actually had 8 backers choose the local pickup option. I just wanted to bring that up because that was something I noticed when I was setting up my rewards, and I was like, I've never actually done that. But occasionally, like probably a handful of times, I've had people ask to sort of come to the house. Hey, we're local. Can we just come pick it up? But how did that go for you? Or is that something that you stuck with, or is it just kind of like not worth the hassle?
So that's a very interesting question because I've been dealing with that recently. Part of the reason I'm into comics is to the point where I'm now creating my own comics because I want to tell these stories, is because I moved to a neighborhood where there was a comic book store in Montreal called Crossover Comics. And I became friends with the people who owned and ran the comic book store, and they really kind of helped me get my modern education in comics. And when we were doing the first Kickstarter for Code 45, the book is set in Montreal, and we figured, we're going to have probably a lot of local support because of that. I talked to the people who run Crossover, and they were willing to serve as a pickup point for us if people wanted to get their books there instead of paying shipping since they live in the same city. And for the first issue, it went okay. For the second and third, and then third and fourth issues, we had the problem where I think possibly this is pandemic related because people were not leaving their houses with the same regularity. The stores were not open at the same level as they were previous, but there were books that kind of languished in behind the counter for up to a year where people didn't come and pick up their books. And I would send out reminders and people would be like, oh yeah, I'll go get it. And then they didn't get it. This campaign for Dead Air, I decided not to do a local pickup. It's the first time we're not doing it because I felt bad having Crossover dealing with, it wasn't a lot of books that got left over, maybe like 5 to 8 books for a given campaign, but that's still taking up space in their store. And I don't want to stress them out with that kind of thing. So it was an interesting experiment. And I think for most people, it worked. Most people came, showed up, picked up their books, and they were happy they didn't have to pay the $10 shipping or whatever it was. But there's enough outliers where I don't think it's as much of an appeal as it would at first seem. And the other issue too is when you're creating Kickstarters, in order to, at the time when we were doing that, now you can specify shipping a little bit differently in Kickstarter. But at the time we had to create a specific tier that was pickup only. And since we had 2 tiers per campaign that were pickup only, we had the book and then we had the full graphic novel. That becomes extra overhead that you have to manage on the back end.
Yeah.
And it's also a bit of clutter on the right-hand side of the page where people, they scroll and they're like, well, I don't live in Montreal. This isn't helpful for me. And it keeps people from discovering other tiers that they might be more interested in supporting. So I think for us, eliminating that clutter and helping de-stress the people at Crossover Comics, that's why we're not going to move forward with that.
Interesting. Yeah, I think it's a cool option, but for many of the reasons that you said, might not be the appeal that you would think it might be otherwise. Also, I do think as a frequent backer of Kickstarters, like, it's just nice to be delighted and surprised when a package shows up. It's like, ooh, what's this going to be?
It's fun to get a Gemini mailer and not know what's inside, right? Like it's like Christmas every couple of weeks, It's a lot of fun. And I
Exactly.
ended up when the comic book stores were not operating, I ended up trying to deliver as many of those locally as I could, because a lot of them were people that I knew who were, because I'm in Montreal, friends are supporting the campaign, so I was trying to take care of it that way. But even doing that, there were some left over. So it's I think that if you have a campaign where let's say you have 5 books or 6 books, and they're large, they're bulky, lots of rewards, and the shipping costs are very high, and you live in Montreal's a large city, it's about 4 million, 5 million people in the metro area. If you have a large local market that is appealing to your book specifically because it's either set there or it involves something culturally about your urban area, then maybe you could save people a ton of cash on shipping in that sense. But if it's a simpler campaign that doesn't have a huge shipping cost, I don't think it's worth it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've also seen some creators like, oh well, I've got a convention coming up, maybe I'll offer to let people pick it up there. But honestly, then you have to worry about specific orders and then tracking them back to the syncing up with BackerKit or Kickstarter, and then that you're going to be traveling them and packing them up and unpacking them, so the chances of damage goes up. Usually, it's just easier to when you're shipping, when you're doing conventions or doing other things, focus on that. But
I mean, simplifying is the biggest kindness you can do to yourself as a Kickstarter creator when it comes to fulfillment. And I didn't realize that until probably my 3rd campaign, when I started streamlining the types of mailers I was using, the shipping options I was using, knowing what fits in well with other types of rewards, knowing what's easier to pack. I mean, when you're stuffing 400 or 500 envelopes, you really want to make sure that it's not going to kill you.
Yeah, it really becomes about speed and efficiency, and another thing, like I will often get help for like when I've got a shipping stuff, and sometimes I'll have people come to the house to help me pack and stuff like that. It also cracks me up though. There's a learning curve for this stuff. At this point, like I can flip a Gemini mail or a bag of comic book, in my sleep with my eyes closed. Seeing someone come to it new that hasn't shipped 10,000 comics in their life, it's like, oh, they're a lot slower than.
The first time I did it, it was like just figuring out how to fold a Gemini mailer.
Oh, I had to YouTube it.
Me too.
I think I ripped the first one I had.
Yeah.
I couldn't figure out the sorcery. It's funny. Well, is there any you mentioned Studio Alpaca, any other projects that the studio or you or someone else that you want to call out, or just that you're looking forward to just starting to get the early buzz about?
I'm starting to, so under the Studio Alpaca banner, at the same time as Dead Air, kind of simultaneously working on a very, very different type of, it's a different project in terms of style and genre, but thematically it shares a lot of similarities. As you can kind of tell from Code 45 to Dead Air, music's a really important thing in my life, and so much of Dead Air draws from my own experience as a college radio DJ in the 90s, which was something I very much enjoyed. And I know that radio doesn't have the same stature that it does now, and you reach out online, you don't reach out over the airwaves. But at that same time in my life, just a year or so after I was in college radio, I started working as a rave promoter. And I'm currently working on a manga book with my former promoting partner that explains how raves work, how booking talent works, the electronic music scene in the 2000s. And we decided to use a manga format because there's so many really cool books out there. Like I remember I read this book called Skullface Bookseller Honda-san, which is about a woman who worked at a bookstore in Tokyo. And she used her employment as a way to explain the whole publishing industry in Japan and how it works and why people buy certain books and why people distribute certain books and all the different genres. And I found that really inspiring. And I kind of decided to apply that logic to the rave scene. And it's like, well, why are certain genres popular? How do DJs get booked? How do you find a venue to throw a rave? Who are the people showing up at these music events? And we've been working on that for the past 6 or 7 months, and it's probably going to come out in 2024 as a manga. And it's going to be so different because it's not going to be single issues. It's going to be collected. It kind of goes against everything that I've done so far on Kickstarter. So it's going to be another learning curve. But part of that is, I think, the fun and the challenge of telling new stories, stories that you can't necessarily find in the direct market, stories that aren't necessarily going to speak to everyone, but the people that they do speak to are really going to enjoy. So
Yeah.
that's kind of what we're working on at the same time as Dead Air over at Studio Alpaca.
Well, I love one of the that or just how you're able to, what's the old advice? Write what you know, but do it in a way that is within a high pitched concept that would appeal to just general people that aren't immersed in that world necessarily. But so many of the really great writers and creators and storytellers that I follow on Kickstarter, like they're able to combine this like a really juicy hook with something that is also, hey, and here's why I'm writing this, and here's what uniquely makes me suited to tell a story with these trappings or in this world or in this environment or with these characters in particular. And it just makes it a lot of fun, and it makes it something that like you can't just get, it's not the generic like book that anyone could write, because to really know this world, you probably would have had to lived it and loved it, right?
Yeah, that lived experience, I think, is key to a lot of storytelling. I know that. So I'm a freelance writer by trade, and I get to interview people all the time who talk about things they're passionate about.
Yeah.
And whether that's a project that they're working on, whether that's art that they're making, whether that's a lifestyle that they live, I think that translating that passion onto the page is the most compelling thing you can do in writing. And I try personally, I have a lot of story ideas, but I always try to filter that through my own passion for an element of that story, because I feel that comes through regardless of what the narrative is. If you can tell that the team who are behind what you're reading they really have that energy and that interest and that passion for whatever the setting is, whatever the trappings of the story are, it will set your work apart. And also it's just more fun if you're interested in your story and you're not just knocking it out because, okay, I know this story is interesting and I know people will want to read it, versus this is a story that I absolutely have to tell because I would, if we were sitting in a room together facing each other, I would be telling you this story right now. Like I find that there's a big difference between that type of storytelling. And the beautiful thing about sequential art and comics is having the unlimited visual budget to tell any story you want to tell from any perspective you want, to include the characters that you want to include, to have them represent everything you want to represent. There's no limitations here. And that's what draws me to comics more than anything else. Is there's really nothing stopping me from, and Joe and Angela and Maya, from telling the story that we want to tell and having control over every aspect of it. And I don't mean that like in a controlling sense, like you hear about movie directors who are obsessive about every single element of their art. I just mean that there's no restrictions where we don't ever look at a page and say, oh, I wish we could have done something different. I wish we could have done this or that, because we can do something different. If we don't like it, we can change it. We can make it what we want to make it. And we can bring that passion to the page. There's no barriers to entry to doing that. The only barriers really are time and your willingness to invest in building an audience for your work.
Yeah, I think that's such a great perspective to have. And one of the reasons I think once you get into comics, it's very hard to get out, because the possibilities are endless. And it always cracks me up when I see, or watch a big budget movie. Saw Guardians of the Galaxy 3, which was great, but it takes 4 minutes of fast scrolling credits to see how many human beings,
thousands of people touch that movie. Yeah, for sure.
Exactly. And to be able to just pull together a small studio and create stories that live with people and that you can build audiences around and really impact the world is one of the special things about our medium. And so
for sure. And the risk level, if a movie company has to pay thousands of people to create a movie, they can't gamble. They have to know that people are going to show up in the theater, and they have to know that a certain number of people are going to show up in the theater. Otherwise, that they absolutely cannot make that investment. With comics, yes, comics are expensive, more so than other literary mediums, because let's face it, artists, it takes a long time to create quality art, and they should be compensated for that time. That's just how it is. And that can be a barrier to entry. But at the same time, if you're comparing it against other visual mediums like film, it's a tiny infinitesimal like percentage point of the overall cost. And so you can take more risks, and you can also take more time to find your audience. You don't have to rely on finding your audience the Friday your movie opens. You can find your audience over 4 or 5 Kickstarter campaigns that are going to gradually build the people who are interested in your book, who are telling other people how great your book is and how much they think they would enjoy it. So it's, again, you get more runway, you have unlimited freedom, and you can, the shackles are completely gone.
Yeah, and I think where we are here in 2023 with Kickstarter and crowdfunding sort of being a fully formed thing that is out there and wildly effective, is that I'd say maybe 10, 20 years ago in the world of comics, many of the projects that would have otherwise been crowdfunded might have gone a cover in 5 pages, a pitch that then got sent to the inboxes of busy editors that never were going to have time to give that the anointing approval. And so those things went nowhere, and that creator went and started working on the next pitch or the next pitch. And,
for sure.
And there are plenty of aspiring creators, I think, who spent a lot of time never actually completing a comic and just but have a whole portfolio full of pitches that never went anywhere. And
that's an amazing point. I mean, you can't develop. I'm lucky to have been. I've been freelance writing for about 15 years, and so much of development as a writer is being able to write a whole bunch of stuff that maybe not a lot of people see. But you get it out of your system, you start to learn how to get better at doing something, and then you build on that success, whether it's internal success or whether it's finding outlets for your work. But if you're a comic writer and you never get a chance for other people to see your work at all, or you never get a chance to complete that narrative arc because, like you said, you just did 5 pages and then an editor or a studio or a publisher said, we don't really have space for this in our calendar, you don't get to grow that way. And on Kickstarter, you can grow in a public way that improves your work over time. That's an incredible asset. I think a lot about having come from the music industry. If you think about how accessible music is now in terms of being able, financially, things are radically different than they were 15, 20 years ago, in some ways for the better, in a lot of ways for the worse. But the idea that you can create and find an audience is so much easier now than it used to be. You look at subgenres that exist where there are hundreds and hundreds of people producing, say, 80s inspired synthwave music. There's absolutely no way that a label would have put out hundreds of albums of synthwave music for a very small market. In a traditional, in the 1990s or the early 2000s, in a traditional music business atmosphere. It just would not have happened. But today, it can happen. Just like those 5-page comic pitches are now becoming 22-page first issues that people are actually reading. My first comic was a success. That's crazy. That's insane. Would that have happened 20 years ago? No, I'm nobody. I came out of nowhere. But this Kickstarter gave me the opportunity to find success, gave me the opportunity to learn in public. And I was so lucky to partner with someone like Joe, who had an established comics career and could help me structure things visually, sequentially, show me the ropes. But I would not have even had that opportunity had Kickstarter not existed.
Yeah. It's, for all the challenges, for all the difficulties, for all the struggles, boy, are we lucky to be doing what we're doing at this point in time in the universe. So, I think that's a great place to pause this conversation for now, Benjamin. The book is Dead Air #1. It is on Kickstarter right now. Just before we let you go, what's the deal with the soundtrack and the music component for this book? I always love seeing innovative rewards, standout rewards on Kickstarter.
We like the term sci-fi with the soundtrack because big part of Dead Air is the personalities who work at the radio station. This is when you're in your late teens, early 20s, that's kind of a time in your life when pop culture defines so much about who you are. Yeah. And you, especially since this book takes place in a small town where you're maybe a little isolated from pop culture, you grab on to what you see and you make it a part of yourself in a way that maybe you wouldn't if you had peers around you who were also doing the same thing. So a lot of the characters in the book, the college radio DJs, they're represented by their fashion, by their music choices, by their lifestyles that are tied in to the music that they play at the radio station. So in our previous book in Code 45, we had a lot of DJ friends put together DJ mixes for the book that represented the era of music we were talking about in the early 2000s rave scene. For this book, we're going to be putting together playlists for each of the individual DJs, what they would have played on their radio shows in 1997. So we have the main character, Michelle. Her show's called Britopia. She's into Britpop. It didn't really break in America the same way it did in Europe, right? So this is a person who's living in a bubble of a subculture that kind of hit it big across the ocean. She's maybe the only person in her small town that listens to this music, but she's super passionate about it. So you're going to hear all the songs that she would have played on her show. And we have a DJ who loves country music. We have a DJ who loves metal. We have a DJ who loves alternative rock. We have an electronic music DJ. We have a classical music DJ, and all of these musical preferences are reflected in their personalities. So as the campaigns go on and we kind of touch more on the lives individually of each DJ, we're going to get into their musical tastes. One thing that we really wanted to do as a reward for this book was send out mixtapes. Because 1990s were like peak mixtape era. People were making mixed CDs if they had the money to do that, but not everyone had a CD burner in 1997. So we were like, oh, I'd love to put together a Britpop mixtape or a metal mixtape, but it's not necessarily legal to do that. Canada has some very interesting copyright laws regarding copying music onto analog format and transmitting it. But we're still looking into whether we can license music to send out as a reward. Until then, we have a really cool surprise reward that's coming in the third week of our Kickstarter that's going to touch on the mixtape concept that I think people are really going to like. So until we can get, hire all the lawyers we need to hire, we're going to be focusing on this surprise reward tier that's kind of brings some of the mixtape magic into the Kickstarter.
Nice. Yeah, no, I love it. I love just how you, especially for a 90s era setting. I love how you can really, nothing brings you to that era quite like contextualizing it with the music of the times.
For sure.
And revealing character and drama and everything. So love it. Benjamin, this was a great conversation, and I'm excited for this book and to see more from you and the whole team that you put together. Thanks so much for sharing it with the audience today, and best of luck on Kickstarter. You're about halfway there after just launching yesterday, and I think this looks like another winner for you and the team.
Well, thanks so much for having me on today. I always enjoy our conversations, and I appreciate everything you do for the community. I know people who are watching this already know, but Tyler's work for Kickstarter and people using Kickstarter is incredible. Your site is such a resource for me when I was first starting out, and it continues to be a resource for me. And I try to send as many people as I can to what you're doing, because you do nothing but help people. And that's not a common thing in this world. And I appreciate that you're doing that.
Well, thanks so much for saying that. I appreciate those kind words, and anyone that you send our way, we'll hopefully get them in a good shape to have the kind of success that you're having and so many others are having, bringing their projects to life. It's good. It's a beautiful thing to see, and I love being a part of this comics crowdfunding Kickstarter community. It's been one of the joys of my life. So I appreciate you saying that and giving me a chance to just hopefully bring even more people into the fold here. But thanks everyone else for tuning in and for watching this. We can't wait to see what you launch next. Take care, everybody.